All right, welcome everybody. We are live. We're going to give it just a few for some folks to join us, and then we are going to jump in with the program.
All righty. Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our town hall on traffic warrants and racial justice. I'm Leisa Moseley, State Director for the Fines and Fees Justice Center. We are a national organization that works to eliminate fees associated with the criminal justice system and make fines more equitable and more just. We're excited to host this webinar tonight, this town hall, to bring you information on some of the things that are happening around this issue here in the state of Nevada. I have some esteemed panelists with me that you will meet in just a few minutes. And for now, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping, of course. If you have any questions that you would like to direct to our panelists, or if you have any comments about the issue, if you're watching on Facebook, we ask that you put them in the comment section. We have someone who is moderating that and who is taking care of the technical issues. I'm sorry, the technical side of this, and we'll be making sure that your questions get addressed. If you're registered and you're watching this via Zoom, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'd like to thank you. My name is Leisa Moseley. I have some with me tonight. I have Kendra Bertschy. Kendra is a public defender with the Washoe County Public Defender's Office. Kendra has been working on this issue for a long time. She is a felony criminal defense attorney and works as a government liaison. And Kendra is working on this issue by making sure that people's voices are heard. She's making sure that people have adequate defense and that this issue is getting the attention that it deserves. She's making sure that underrepresented and marginalized people have a voice, and she is serving as in a wonderful capacity, making sure that these folks' voices are heard and that they have adequate representation. Next, I have Nick Shepack. Nick is with the ACLU. Nick comes to us with, he got his master's degree in social work, and he has been working on the issue of fines and fees for a long time. He works with the community, he works with the Fines and Fees Justice Center, he works with all of these different organizations. Nick is amazing and he's doing great work, and we're happy to have him as a panelist tonight. Next, we have Wiz Rouzard, who is the Community Engagement Director for Americans for Prosperity. It's important that Wiz is here, so we understand that this is not a partisan issue. This is a bipartisan issue, it's a nonpartisan issue, and this affects people on all sides of the aisle. And so Wiz being here from Americans for Prosperity tonight, Wiz, we're excited to have you, we thank you, and we look forward to hearing your comments on this. Also, we have Ms. Leslie Turner. Everybody knows who Leslie Turner is. We've heard that name. She is a rock star in the world of activism and community organizing. She comes to us from PLAN. She is the campaigns manager, Justice Campaigns Manager for PLAN. So welcome, Leslie. Fines and fees, warrants. In 2020, Las Vegas Justice Court suspended over 270,000 outstanding warrants for arrest that were related to traffic fines and fees. Think about that number for just a second. Over 270,000 warrants were issued for people who simply could not pay an outstanding traffic fine or fee. Most of these folks that have traffic warrants are members of the Black community, members of the Latino community. Black folks comprise 46.3% of the warrants issued in the greater Las Vegas area. Hispanic people comprise over 20% of the warrants issued in the greater Las Vegas area. That's an astronomical number. Warrants trap people in a cycle of poverty that is nearly impossible to get out of. It makes it impossible in many cases for people to support their families. It makes it impossible for them to buy groceries. It makes it impossible for them to support themselves and just have a life that we all would like to live. Warrants for traffic fines and fees is an antiquated practice that absolutely needs to end. It doesn't increase collection rates. It doesn't increase public safety. It's just a practice that is harmful. It harms communities. It harms communities. We'll just leave it right there. I'm gonna now, I wanna just give you a couple of more statistics on it. Many of the warrants that are issued, in fact, most of the warrants issued have nothing to do with driving. Some of the top 10 reasons that people get warrants issued are for things like driving without a valid license, driving on an expired registration, driving without proof of insurance, and in some cases, driving or having an unregistered trailer. These are some of the things that people are getting traffic warrants issued for, and they have nothing to do with public safety. So how is that making our state more safe? How is that an effective practice? And why are we continuing to use this practice when we have proof from other states, we have proof from jurisdictions that show this is a harmful practice? We're going to ask those questions of our panelists tonight. So again, we thank you for joining us. And if you're just now logging on, if you have questions, if you're watching us live on Facebook and you have questions, make sure you drop them in the comment section and someone will make sure your questions get answered. If you're participating via Zoom, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. All right, panelists, we're gonna go. Oh, I think I forgot to introduce our Assemblywoman. Did I forget to do that? See, trying to be so professional.
It's all
we
good.
have with us, let me apologize, first of all, for getting to introduce our Assemblywoman, Rochelle Nguyen, who has brought legislation forth again to decriminalize traffic violations here in Nevada. Some of you may remember that in 2019, there were efforts to decriminalize traffic violations as well. That bill did not get through. We did have some legislation that made it a little bit easier, but we are really grateful for Assemblywoman Rochelle Nguyen, who has brought this bill back, and we hope that it will get through this time, and we hope that we're going to end this practice. So with that, if y'all are ready, we're going to go into a few questions. I'm going to start with Ms. Leslie Turner. Leslie, and all of you panelists, I'm directing these questions to a particular panelist, but feel free to jump in and answer and offer your own insight into this if you feel the need to do so. It is well known that fines and fees and warrants, something that as minor, fines and fees for something as minor as a parking ticket can trap people in a cycle of debt and criminalization. How have you seen this issue play out in your own personal experience and in your own work within your community?
So first, I just want to say thanks for having me on this panel. And I want to also just preface by saying that, year after year, as we've been trying to decriminalize traffic tickets and also just work on criminal justice reform in general, we always have to relive this trauma, and it is trauma. So I want to start with that to say that, I was arrested for traffic tickets when my son was 4 months old. He's 5 years old now. So imagine being a new mother. I was actually had no income at the time. My mom was paying my rent for me. I was trying to figure out how I was going to manage a newborn. He was premature, which was, added stress, just trying to figure everything out. And at 4 months old, I finally decided that when he was 4 months old, I finally got a job, and I was like, okay, great. I'm going to start working. I'll have income and I can get on my feet. I was on my way to work, and yes, I was driving. No, I knew I had warrants and I knew my tags were expired. But again, coming out of a situation where I just gave birth and I didn't have an income, I had to do what I had to do. So I had just started working at Catholic Charities as a caseworker, and I was on my way to work. I had just dropped off my infant child with the babysitter, and I got pulled over. They took me to jail. I was separated from my child for a week. And I think the hardest part about that was that my son was 4 months old and I was breastfeeding him. I remember asking the COs if I could pump because my breasts were filling up with milk. And they said no, the most they could do is give me an aspirin and let me take a shower. So, I remember the ladies in there comforting me and consoling me, letting me know, oh, don't worry, sis, you'll be out in a few days, it's not that serious, it's just traffic tickets. And exactly, that's the point. It's traffic tickets. It's an inability to pay. It's not something that I needed to be put in a cage for. And I think that was really a turning point for me. It really was part of the catalyst of why I do the work. And, and that really wasn't even the end of it for me as far as getting out. I still owed money. I had to go through a bail bondsman to get out. I, still had to pay the bail bonds, which that money didn't even go towards the actual traffic tickets. And it was actually years later that those tickets were resolved. And, and it resulted in me losing my driver's license. I had to pay to get it reinstated. And, in the meantime, between clearing my tickets and paying the DMV, I got another ticket for driving on a suspended driver's license. So again, this is just an example of how people like myself, who I don't consider myself to be a public safety threat. I'm actually out here every single day trying to help my community and help people that are less fortunate, and pay for housing and pay for people's food and deliver food to people and do all types of things in my community. But yet I'm put into a cage because I didn't have the money, and I truly did not. And so this is a story that happens over and over again. And, like I said, I preface this with sharing that, it is trauma. And yes, it is it impacts the economy. And yes, there's a lot of different, arguments that can be said when it comes to, jailing people for traffic tickets. But for me, I'm thinking about the psychological impacts that had on my infant child being separated from him. I'm thinking about the long-term impact that had on me and also his health. I wasn't able to actually resume breastfeeding him because, from a week of not being able to pump, when I got out, it's like my milk just dried up and I was already struggling to breastfeed him anyway. So, there was a lot of long-term effects. And I think those are the things that are often missed and not talked about. We're just so used to throwing people in cages to solve problems that actually have nothing to do with public safety. And also, public safety needs to be defined by the public. It needs to be defined by the people, not by government, not by systems, not by law enforcement. Like, we should actually be explaining to government and to systems what actually keeps us safe, because separating me from my child didn't keep me safe in that moment. It didn't keep him safe. So this is a story that's not unique to me. I have multiple friends, pretty much almost everybody I know has at some point been jailed for unpaid traffic tickets, and that it's really sad. And also, I would say maybe at 1 in 2 or 3, or maybe like 1 in 3 people that I know right now, licenses are currently suspended as well due to failure to pay. So obviously those issues are connected, but it is something that we really need to take a look at. I'm really glad that this bill is coming back to the legislature. So thank you for raising that again. And, hopefully we can get it done this year.
Thank you for that, Leslie. One of the issues that you mentioned that I don't think we talk about enough when it comes to people actually being arrested for these issues is many times these are mothers with their children in their car. And what happens to those children if their mother is arrested and taken off to jail, as it was your case? Sometimes law enforcement may give them the opportunity to call a friend to pick their children up, but in many cases they don't. Chair of the Black Caucus, Yvette Williams, shared her story today about a woman who had a similar situation like yours. She was arrested with her children in the car, but her children were hauled off to Child Haven. Her DPS, Child Protective Service, was called, and her children were taken. I want to talk to Assemblywoman Rochelle Nguyen, because this is an impossible choice where many times people are having to drive anyway. So can you talk to us about why this bill is important and what it will do to eliminate that issue of people driving anyway? Because it really doesn't have a lot to do or anything to do with public safety. I mentioned some of the things that people get warrants for, and they have nothing to do with driving. So Assemblywoman, can you talk to us about why you felt it was important to bring this bill back and how this is going to eliminate some of those issues?
I think this is a step in the right direction. It's not going to correct racial injustice, but or create instant, equity in that area. But I think we need to move away from criminalizing poverty. We need to get away from criminalizing. I think you said it best actually during your testimony when you said that people are not defying the law. They are not criminals. They are not trying to do it. This is a pay thing. They have the inability to pay these fines. I always think of the perfect example that I see in my practice, because I'm a criminal defense attorney in my day job, is you will see someone that gets a traffic matter. They get a $150 ticket. And to be quite honest, $150 is a lot of money for most people. It's a lot of money for me to think about. So I know that most people, this is like the difference between whether or not they're going to eat for the entire month or they're going to pay a traffic ticket. So you have a $150 ticket. You go in and you're not even seeing a judge. You're going into the window. You're doing your civic duty. You're like, I made a mistake. I was speeding. I'm going to go and try to pay this ticket. And you go to a ticket window and you are dealing with a clerk who is unbound by certain requirements that they have in that jurisdiction. And you say, I want to pay this ticket. And they say, okay, do you have the $150? Which you don't. So you think, I'm going to set up a payment plan. which tax on another like $40 to $75, depending on the jurisdiction. So let's just say it's another $50. Now all of a sudden you're at $200 for that traffic matter. And then you're asked for a payment plan and they say, just so you know, we can't do less than $100 a month for that ticket. And so then you set into just spirals. And then you come in and you're like, you know what? I only have $50. So they come back to the court again and say, here's my $50. And the court sometimes, some jurisdictions are like, we're not going to take that because it's not the full $100. And so we're going to put you in warrant because you have failed to pay. And in some jurisdictions, that's like a contempt charge. So now you have another charge on your record. So you have these two charges now, and you have $250 that's been added to your $200 like ticket. Now you have a new failure to pay like ticket, and then you possibly get pulled over on driving on a suspended license because of this failure to pay this warrant. And now all of a sudden you have $500, $250, and another $250, and you're almost up to $1,000 in tickets. It's just insane. And so this cycle of like poverty just like persists. And I'm not trying to make light of it by laughing, but it's just so outrageous that we still in 2021 are still treating traffic tickets in this way. So I keep that in mind. You talked about, women being incarcerated, and it's not just even incarceration. We have a lot of people in some jurisdictions that are putting people on house arrest to pay off like their tickets. So we are having someone confined to their home, which I suppose is better than being confined, in our jails, but they're paying for house arrest as opposed to like the jail. It's just outrageous that we're using our resources in the way that we are. So hopefully, with the passage of Assembly Bill 116 during this session, there will be some relief and we will be taking a step in the right direction. I always tell people, I was like, we're not on the progressive end of things here in Nevada. In fact, we're catching up with like other states, not like, a lot of times you hear people like, oh, we're becoming California. And I was like, we're becoming like Utah, or we're becoming like Wyoming and Montana. Like we're, which are great places, but I'm like, they're doing it right. So I think we need to be on that end as well.
Right. And Nevada is one of only 13 states that have not actually decriminalized the system of traffic violations. So I'm hoping that this legislation passes and that we can be in alignment with other states and thinking of just different ways to deal with this issue. I want to talk with Kendra. And I would like, because being a public defender, you are representing people who are caught up in this system probably on a daily basis. You have seen, I'm sure, some of the most heinous cases. Can you just talk to us a little bit about some of the effects that this has on your clients and the cycle of poverty that people get in? Is there a way for some of these people to get out of this cycle? How do your clients handle this?
Thank you so much. And Lisa, I appreciate you inviting me to participate in this event tonight. And I also really appreciate Assemblywoman Nguyen for bringing forward her bill, because I do think that it is a huge step in order to help overcome these inequities that are built into our systems. And as you heard from Ms. Turner, her story isn't alone. This is very unfortunately common. And I mentioned in testifying on a different bill this morning, just what it's like when you have to speak with someone who, as Assemblywoman Nguyen said, they didn't really do anything criminal action. What they did is they maybe had were speeding. And so that going 11 miles over the speed limit, they got that ticket, couldn't pay the fine, and then were arrested because of that. They, depending on the situation, they could lose their jobs and for remaining in custody, not being able to tell anyone where they are, because as we know, nobody knows anybody's cell phone number. So they can't call their employer to say, hey, I'm not going to be at work because I was arrested on a violation on a warrant that I didn't even know I had. And they lose their jobs. They could lose their apartments, depending on the time of the month that they're incarcerated. And from that period, they could not be able to pay for the next month's rent, get evicted, lose their children, because if they were taken into custody, CPS is notified, and then they have to get started on that. In the process, it really highlights how horrible it is for these individuals when they're dealing with this situation, because there's no easy way out. And that's why we think decriminalizing traffic tickets makes so much sense, because it takes it out of that criminal arena. Because when you put someone into the criminal justice system, it just spirals. As you heard from Assemblywoman Nguyen, those traffic tickets and those fines and fees and assessments keep adding up. What we didn't talk about is for that warrant, for if someone was picked up on that, that could be $350 fee on top of that. It is unfortunately not uncommon to see traffic tickets that started off as maybe the $200 end up in costing people thousands of dollars. So that's why we have to change that now.
You know, one of the issues that we have here in Nevada is we do not have a grace period in the state. And so you talked about traffic warrants and some of the fees that come with that. But there are fees when someone wants to get on a payment plan. There are fees that come with that range. And from what our research has shown is those fees are not uniform across the state. Some jurisdictions, it may be a $50 fee. Some jurisdictions, it may be a $150 fee. But one of the most heinous things that I think is happening is that even people who are on payment plans, if you miss a payment, let's just say your payment is due today. If by 12 midnight, as the system currently is, if by 12 midnight you have not made that payment, you are automatically back in warrant status, subject to additional warrant fees. And before you can even begin paying on that fine, you have to pay those warrant fees. And so again, fee on top of fee. This is how people end up with these astronomical amounts of debt and fees that they simply cannot pay. And so I want to talk with Wiz for a moment, or all of you. People being able to pay their fines and fees. We have seen research that shows when these barriers are removed, when warrants are taken away, when some of the fees are taken away, people actually are able to pay their fines, and they do so. This just puts more money. How does this affect our economy? We believe that we've seen some jurisdictions where the state revenue has gone up. California saw an increase in their revenue when they stopped suspending for traffic warrants. When they stopped that practice, we saw revenue go up. So Wiz, I want to ask you, how do you think this affects our economy, and how is this going to benefit our economy here in Nevada?
Well, thank you, Leisa, for having us this evening with American for Prosperity. We're committed to breaking down barriers that stand in people's way of realizing their greatest potential, which helps society move towards a mutual benefit society where people succeed by helping others improve their lives, and putting and erecting these type of barriers just doesn't do it. If people cannot even take care of their families and pay the underlying debt that's right now lingering, imposing criminal penalties, I mean, that's not gonna make it any easier for them to pay those debts, and will actually make it a lot more difficult. And it'll make it difficult by, a lot of people aren't aware, by making it hard for them to actually be able to qualify for jobs, right? We're talking about accessing employment opportunities where these individuals can actually contribute to society. Sorry to hear your story, Leslie, but it's also a lot of people's story. And I'm so glad that you're courageous to share that, because of course, that's what happens when you have a traffic ticket in Nevada. It doesn't matter if you're a single parent, if you're on your way to pick up your kid, or you're headed to work. It's about taking you off the street for an issue that anyone looking at it wouldn't constitute it to be a public safety issue. And we've seen Carson City, to answer your question, where these type of economic impacts actually increases compliance. When you give people the flexibility to resolve matters, you get a lot greater propensity of compliance. And we've seen that throughout the states. Now, it's sad to say that this issue is so premature that data is still unfolding as we speak to really espouse the great impact. But I think what's important is, for us as an organization, we see that conservatives believe in small government, but our justice system and the court system are central government functions that should be funded fully. But funding these systems by collecting revenue from people who truly cannot afford to pay fees that are only intended as revenue is counterproductive. It prevents these people from actually achieving their full and most contributable potential with our local economy and communities. And we say law enforcement should be focused on serious crimes. And with the trust that we currently have in the public safety aspect with law enforcement, these are the issues. There's other issues to be resolved by law enforcement rather than wasting these type of resources being what we call tax collectors. So we see that we need to rethink the way law enforcement interacts with local communities. We need to make sure that they're doing everything to rebuild the trust And, you know, forcing police officers to act as tax collectors, that's not going to help rebuild that trust. So we as an organization is doing everything we can to build bridges where those who consider not wanting to pass a legislation like this, we're bringing them down to where community members can share their stories, and they can see firsthand what the impacts are in our overall local economy.
Thank you for that. You know, one of the points of opposition that we hear a lot when it comes to decriminalizing traffic warrants or even with license suspensions is that how are we going to get people to pay? What is the incentive that will make people pay? Why would people want to pay their fines or fees? And you know, historically, law enforcement and some of the courts have been opposed to this, but it looks like those things are changing. And Nick, I want to ask you, from your perspective with the ACLU and the work that you do, you know, what do you think is the cause of it? What do you think is the reason why this conversation is shifting and more people are coming on board and supporting the efforts to decriminalize traffic warrants, traffic violations here in Nevada?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for having me on this wonderful panel. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I want to preface this by saying, while I spend a lot of my time trying to understand exactly how law enforcement thinks, that is maybe a fool's errand at times. But with these real common sense reforms that we can show with data, work in the places that have done it, I do think that law enforcement is often one of the last to the table. Like, they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. But once they really can see that things work, they tend to come around. And that's what we're seeing this session. We're seeing all kinds of people that opposed this legislation last session deciding that they're going to oppose it. At the very least, they're not going to come out against it this time. And I think it's really, we saw it work in Carson City, at least to an extent. And when you talk to the sheriff there, he's happy, right? We have, there's been a lot of talk about funding for police, and I think police departments themselves are getting wise to the fact that doing something like chasing 200,000+ people for warrants that are based on minor traffic violations is not a wise way to spend money, is not a good allocation of time. And then also when we look at the last year, I think there's a real understanding that there's going to have to be some reforms made. There's going to have to be some gives by law enforcement. I think they're really taking stock of, you know, where they're ready to make these changes and these reforms, and they're listening to the community. You know, I hope that some of this is more than just a financial picture, and it is a real understanding of community and looking at stories such as Leslie's and seeing the impact on the community. You know, that is up for debate, but I do hope that there is that kind of look. I also think that with COVID, you know, can you imagine what those conversations? We know once COVID got into the jails and prisons, it was devastating, and really, I think we had to question ourselves as a community, as a law enforcement community, as a community as a whole. You know, what are we putting people in these dangerous situations for? And is it for failure to register your trailer, right? That is just ridiculous. So I think, you know, to sum it up, that law enforcement often comes around to these reforms that we've been pushing for a long time. It takes a while. I'm really glad to see that they're here on this one. There's a lot more to go. As Assemblywoman Nguyen said, this is one step of many into fixing a completely racially unjust system. But you know, the fact that they're coming to the table on this one and they're really willing to show their support gives me hope that we may be able to continue these conversations into other realms of criminal justice reform and hopefully get some law enforcement buy-in.
I agree. You know, one of the things we talked about, and of course the title of this is warrants, traffic warrants and racial justice. You know, I mentioned some numbers earlier about who this issue affects mostly. And so I want all of the panelists to weigh in on this one, or any of them. 46%, over 46% of the warrants that are issued in the greater Las Vegas area are issued to Black people. Hispanic population, over 20% of those warrants go to the Hispanic population. And these are the same communities that have some of the highest rates of unemployment. These are some of the same communities that have the highest rates of food insecurity, but also have the lowest median income. You know, I mentioned today in our presentation to the legislature on traffic suspensions, driver license suspensions, mentioned some of this data. And so any one of you, can we just talk about the racial justice impacts of this? We've seen over the last few months, you know, particularly with some of the killings around the country, we've seen uprisings and we've seen protests, peaceful protests, where people are finally getting to a point where they just had enough. And so this is, I think this is very important in this conversation about how we're treating people. And Nick, I like that you said, you know, we need to start rethinking about how we treat people. This is a human condition. It's about just human beings. It's not just about money. And so I want to talk about that, and I want to direct that to you, Kendra, but of course to all of you. But Kendra, being a public defender, you know, who do you see this issue most affecting? And what are some of the long-term effects of this for people? I know we talked about the cycle of poverty that people get in, but are there any other, Leslie talked about some of the traumas that people experience. Can we talk about that?
Absolutely. So that's a really loaded question, and I will try to answer it as best as I can. But I think Nick's right, is we really have to start reimagining our justice system, because unfortunately there's racial bias throughout the entirety of it. And I can't say that people are doing that intentionally, but there's also implicit bias that's built into the system. And that's why, given the data and statistics that you've shared as to who is targeted by these laws and by the way that we interact with law enforcement for traffic violations, it's really important to start doing that now. I'll just turn to what's really interesting is there's no data saying that having this as a misdemeanor and having traffic violations as a crime actually prevents speeding tickets or anything like that. The Department of Justice issued had a scientific study that they did, which found that actually having increased penalties or the charge itself isn't going to deter criminal conduct. So that whole argument that it needs to be a misdemeanor in order for some, I don't know, to try to deter that conduct just doesn't work. And so the way that we fix it is to, you know, to have these be infractions and to work with people and not have these hidden fees. You talked about earlier with some of the fees that just keep piling up, and some of them you just don't know about. Like if you're going to pay online, that costs more money. And just because, and right now during COVID, that's how you have to do it. And those are, you know, that's money that people don't have. So additionally, I would just say that speeding tickets or other traffic tickets, those stay on your record. They're misdemeanors. For certain occupations, you have to disclose it. In order to apply for schools, some schools, you have to disclose this. I'll let Assemblywoman Nguyen talk about this more, but I've had clients who, well, they weren't really my clients. I had helped them out where they were trying to apply for medical school. And I had a friend calling me in tears because he didn't know what to do because he couldn't apply and put on his application because he had a pending speed, or not, it wasn't even a speeding ticket, it was a ticket because he was driving with his cell phone and he couldn't figure out what to do. And he's now a doctor not in this state because of our issues, because of how it impacted him. And so this is something that not only just for education, but this is something, again, that spirals where it's so difficult to get out of that justice system. And so that's why we really need to start making even minor tweaks like this bill does.
Oh, you're muted.
In an effort to not have all this background noise, I muted myself. But one of the things that comes up is how some of these traffic stops for warrants, let's say somebody has an outstanding warrant and get pulled over, and how these can lead to violent interaction with police. Many times we have seen that, we've heard that happen. And Kendra, I'm glad that you mentioned that these are misdemeanors. There is so much talk lately about these misdemeanors and how they often lead to violent interactions with police. I just want to highlight for a moment some of the things that we've seen around the country. Philando Castile, we've all heard that name. He comes to mind, was pulled over, and it was what he was pulled over for was a misdemeanor. And so thinking about that, these stops and how they lead to, in some cases, can lead to increased violent interactions with police. I'd like any one of you to maybe address that and take that question.
I wouldn't mind taking that. If
Sure,
it's
thank
okay.
you.
You know, one of the things that, you know, with our, for lack of a better term, the summer of unrest, in combination with, you know, a global health pandemic, I think it kind of awoke people to what we need to be looking at and how we can correct some of these things. There's obviously distrust with law enforcement in communities of color when they're being pulled over for traffic violations. There's fear, there's trauma, and how do we overcome that? And how do we protect like our members of like the community? I always think of this like I've been expanding Assembly Bill 116 as I've been looking into it. It's one of those things that I know that it passed like out of the Assembly in 2019, but it almost was a blessing in disguise because I think we can make it an even better bill this time around. You know, I think there's more buy-in. I think there's more collaboration. I think there are a lot of partners that were in opposition last session, and in this session, they're actually coming to the table, whether it's law enforcement, the district attorneys are on board on this time. And I think that will only make it a better bill. And I will tell you in my conversations, my first conversation that I had with a bunch of law enforcement in a small group, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department suggested, you know, during the special session, we talked about collecting data on like stops, like racial, like data, gender, that kind of data, because we really don't have a lot of data in our state about who's being stopped, who's being arrested, what they're being stopped for, what they're being arrested for, what the circumstances are, so we can have more data to come back and say, hey, look, we are targeting these certain communities. We are targeting people of color for traffic stops. And so it was suggested if we're redoing like ticket books for civil infractions, maybe we can include that data piece and that data collection piece within that like thing. So that's one of the amendments that I have forthcoming in Assembly Bill 116 to strengthen it and to collect that, you know, racial data component to see who we're stopping, why we're stopping them, what kind of misdemeanors are we stopping them for, or hopefully what kind of civil infractions are we stopping them for, and what kind of interactions does that lead to? Because I think that's also important to look at. You know, you're being pulled over for a speeding and then all of a sudden you're in the criminal justice system for a bunch of other things. And are we doing that disproportionately in certain communities? So, you know, I think we can always do better, and, you know, I hope that answers it.
No, it does. And I definitely agree. I definitely agree. And, you know, we've in my work with the Fines and Fees Justice Center, you know, we've had some conversations with law enforcement, and I'm happy to know that they are looking at this, beginning to look at this through a different lens and say, you know what, how can we better serve our communities? How can we utilize our officers for really handling more violent crime that's related to maybe public safety? Because this issue, we know that traffic fines and fees and warrants really don't have a lot to do with public safety. We've learned that it doesn't make us safer. It doesn't increase public safety in any way. And so why are we continuing to do this practice? So I'm happy to know and happy to hear that there are folks on all spectrums, whether it's law enforcement, some of the courts, communities, people who may have been in opposition, you know, before, like some of those people that say, you know, we got to have a carrot, we got to have a way to make people pay, and warrants is the way to do it. You know, we're now seeing some of those people come to the table and say, okay, how can we do this differently? How can we do it? So that's really a good thing. I want to get any of the rest of you in here if you have any comments about that. I see Nick has his hand raised, so I'm gonna quickly go to you, Nick. Go ahead.
Yeah, to just continue and piggyback off of this, I think it's important to understand how we got here, right? There was a mindset for a long time that we could criminalize our way into safety. We could criminalize our way into the society that people wanted. And part of that, if we're being honest, was to control over Black and brown communities. But it was also a control over society as a whole. We thought at one time, people making laws, that if we didn't want people to use things like marijuana or drugs, we could just continue to up the penalties until we eradicated the problem. All we have done is solidify certain communities into poverty, and sucked all the community resources out of them, as well as built this giant prison system, this prison industrial complex that is just exploded. And what we've learned is that these criminal penalties for the things that we do every day, whether it's driving or whether it may be substance use or domestic and child rearing things, we've tried to criminalize our way into this perfect world. And what has happened is we've destroyed families, we've broken apart communities, and we're really getting to a point now where we're finally addressing it. And we're realizing that there are other ways to support these communities and to get the results that we want. And so I think that this conversation is just one step in that process to really re-envision the world we live in a way in which, when you see a community member who needs help, or maybe doing something that is even considered reckless, we have a system in place to help address that isn't criminal, that doesn't rip them out of the community for a period of time or devastate them financially. And we've built this system so big and so robust, it's going to take time. But I do think that we're starting to see some real thought in this area.
You bring up a good point, Nick. Thinking about our current system of criminal justice and policing, we're starting to understand how we got here. And we know that our current systems, those were born out of efforts to, the Jim Crow era. Those were born out of the Jim Crow era. They were born out of things like the Black codes in an effort to keep people, as you said, in a particular place and to criminalize them. But it does have a financial component to it. This puts money into our justice system. This puts money into the courts. And that's actually a point of opposition that we've had from some of the jurisdictions around, saying, if we get rid of the system as it currently is, how are we going to fund our courts? How are we going to fund these programs? And so I would like to have some of you maybe speak to that. Wiz, I see your hand. I'm going to give you, but if we could just talk about that point for a minute, the opposition about how are we funding our courts? What are some of the other ways that we can think about this? And how do we look at, what are some of the other things we can do to maybe fund these court programs, or, to fund these court programs? Kendra, you want to take that one? Oh, Wiz, you want to go ahead? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, you hit it on it now. I think we have to go back to, let's get back to the Constitution. These services are services rightfully to the people, but it should be funded on these type of practices. It should be funded through the general fund, Lisa. It's as simple as that. And I think we've deviated so much to where when we incentivize revenue coming from these type of practices to fund programs, then you have an endless perpetual cycle of just injustices and discriminatory practices that occur. And predominantly where it becomes is an economic issue, when people cannot pay just the smallest amount of fines. And because they're working 2 or 3 jobs, single parent, raising kids, and they forget to pay, all of a sudden they're pulled off the streets, thrown into a cell, and basically kept from their family and society. And oftentimes when they come out dealing with more government problems, whether it's child welfare, the child protective services coming in, or walking into office and getting your termination paper. So these are very, very problematic. And we believe that, these type of services that the court system provides should be funded through the general fund and not through these type of practices. But I like to share myself personally, graduating from UNLV as a football player, I too was a victim of these type of practices where on Christmas Day, 4 days before Christmas, I was on Flamingo Maryland Parkway, and in a very jovial spirit, a homeless person came to my window and knocked and was having a sign talking about he wanted to have some food. I gave him a brownie I had just bought from 7-Eleven, and sure enough, as soon as he walks away, the officer pulls me over and he says that I have a $50 cell phone warrant, a $50 cell phone ticket warrant that I thought I resolved or was in the process of resolving. Despite me never having any criminal history whatsoever, despite me letting him know I was on my way to work, he looked to arrest me and threw me in jail. And that was the first time I've ever been in jail, to where the booking officer looked at me and said, "You got to be kidding me." And he said, "I've never seen and don't understand why this is happening." But this happens all the time. For a $50 cell phone ticket, I think that law enforcement officer could have been better used in solving other problems than throwing me behind bars because of a cell phone ticket, which was expediently resolved as soon as I was let out. But the problem is, when you see the economic situation where people are literally working to support their family, this is definitely not a system that should be supported by the revenue from these type of practices. And we should, as a state, look to revert back to the Constitution to where we require these systems are funded through the general fund and not these type of revenue. Thank you, Leisa.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that. I had never heard your story before, but I will offer my own. I know when people see me, they probably don't think that I have also had experience with the system. I was dropping my children off at school. This has been years ago. And there's a point to why I'm bringing this, and I want to direct this probably to Assemblywoman Rochelle Nguyen or maybe even Kendra. But I was dropping my children off at school one day. This was years ago. They were in middle school. They're in their 20s now. But I dropped them off. We were in the street, we're in the middle of the street waiting with a bunch of other parents. And my kids said, "Mom, we'll just get out here." Okay, fine. They get out. And the next thing I know, the school police pulls me over and says, "You didn't pull over to the curb." And he says to me, "Do you have any traffic tickets or anything?" I said, "None that I haven't taken care of." And he said, "Well, there's a warrant for your arrest." And I said, "That can't be." What it was is I had a ticket for something in municipal court, and I paid it in municipal court. But I'd also had one, I think it was in justice court, thinking that I had paid them all, didn't know the difference between municipal court and justice court. And come to find out, I had a warrant for a ticket. And so that I have heard happens an awful lot, that people don't know the difference in what court they're going to. And here in Las Vegas, there's unincorporated Clark County, there's Las Vegas, the city of Las Vegas. And many times people do not know which court that they go to. And Assemblywoman Rochelle or Assemblywoman Nguyen, please, I'm sorry about that, or Kendra, either one of you, or any one of our panelists that might want to address that question. What do we do about that? Is there a way to? I know, Assemblywoman, you talked about making some changes to the tickets themselves. And what can we do? Because I've heard that issue a lot from many people, like they don't know which court they're supposed to go to. How can we remedy that situation?
I think that's a common problem. I know that in sessions past, we've tried to consolidate it. So this used to happen where if you committed a felony and a misdemeanor, the felony would go to the county court or the justice court, and the misdemeanor would go to the municipal court. And so people would have like a situation where they had a felony drug charge and a misdemeanor drug paraphernalia charge, and they would go to two separate courts. And so we've strived to make changes in that area. So the misdemeanor tracks with the felony or the higher charge. In the traffic world, this is a problem that we see all of the time. I'm sure Kendra will confirm that. You see it all the time. I am in private practice, so I have people that want me to help them with tickets. And the first thing I'm like, well, where'd you get the ticket? And so I've become an expert on city lines and county lines in my district, but most people aren't. I think Wiz had mentioned never in a million years did they even think, most people don't realize that criminal tickets are they're criminal. I think they are shocked to know that they could be arrested if they fail to pay that. So that carrot stick thing, I think most people don't realize that at all. And unfortunately, they realize it when they go to purchase a firearm or they go to apply for medical school. I think during the 2019 session, we heard a lot of testimony from Turo medical students that were coming in talking about how this was an impediment to doing this. We always talk about how in our state, we can't get enough medical professionals here. And when we have something silly like this, that's impeding our ability to bring in educated professionals or keep our Nevada residents that are being trained here in our medical schools, from staying here because of traffic matters, it's just crazy to me. So you know, my bill doesn't specifically address that, but it is something that, you know, is a real problem. And it could be sometimes as simple as like, you know, on the form right now, it's just like check boxes. Like you just pop it, like check a box. Like if it's Las Vegas Justice Court, or if it's Las Vegas Municipal Court, or if it's Henderson or Henderson Justice Court. So, you know, I think sometimes even the forms that we use, if we're redoing forms, we should be looking at the clarity of those forms as well.
You know, the Fines and Fees Justice Center, you know, we obtained some data that was related to that issue. It showed that when the information that people need, what court they go to, what time, that information, when it's on the front of the ticket, when it's visible, that it actually, the collection rates go up. You know, it impacts whether people are able to actually go to court and have the information that they need. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm hoping that at some point, maybe not with this bill, but at some point we can make that more uniform across the state, and that all the
it's
tickets.
Actually something that we're actually considering, because we have to redo it. I know law enforcement would like a state issued like ticket, civil citation, like infraction book that is uniform across the state. And I agree with you. I've seen places where they, you know, I mean, there's a lot of unnecessary stuff. Like if I get a ticket, I don't need to know my birth date and my address, like that kind of stuff. I need to know where to pay the ticket. I've seen places that have used innovative like QR codes where you can just scan the QR code and pay your ticket online that way. And it takes you directly to the website that you're going to have to do it. Obviously, some of those like technological like issues, there are equity issues there as well. But, you know, it's good to see that, you know, some places are really taking a look at how do we make this more user friendly for people, because I agree with you. People want to take care of their business. They want to accept responsibility, and sometimes we put so many barriers to do that, whether they're financial or, you know, just simple things like, you know, the ability to read your ticket.
Right. Kendra, I believe you wanted to add something.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think one of the things that's interesting and really been highlighted during COVID is just the different ways we can try to work with our citizens to make everything more accessible. Before, you would have to take off of work in order to go to court to pay the ticket. We're working on being able to have that accessible online so you could pay it online, which will hopefully also assist with the delays in making the payment. I was speaking with a defense attorney today who let me know about a client who had actually mailed the check. It had gone into the system, but hadn't gone to the police officer. So when he was pulled over, there was still the active warrant. So he was then arrested, went to jail, spent several days in jail before he was able to see a judge, because he was arrested on I believe he was arrested on a Thursday night. And so at that time, it was, because it was municipal court, it was Monday morning, and that's all at the taxpayer's expense. And so we learned from the Washoe County Sheriff's Office that depending on the level of care of that individual, that can cost from approximately $130 all the way up to $500 per day. So that's huge. So that's why this is an issue, as Ms. Turner mentioned, this is something that impacts every Nevadan. Everyone knows someone, or maybe themselves, has been involved in the traffic ticket world, but also we're paying for this, and we continue to pay for this. And so that's why I think it's really important, as you mentioned, we need to figure out new ways in order to address this issue, but also how we fund those court systems and how we don't require basically that we have systems built off of the backs of our indigent clients.
You know, talking with law enforcement around this issue, some of the data and information that we obtain for them, you know, we do talk about the cost in terms of what it's cost to house someone in for 2 or 3 days, or I think the average stay was like 75 hours or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it is, but there's a significant cost to that. But in talking with law enforcement, you know, some of the numbers that we got from them, just in what it takes for an officer to pull someone over, arrest them, tow their car, transport them to jail, you know, an officer salary is anywhere from $145 to like $164 per day per officer. So you're right, Kendra, that costs all of us. That's money that's coming out of taxpayers' pockets. And I agree with all of you that there has to be a more efficient way, a better way that we can get people to pay fines and fees and make it more user-friendly, for lack of a better term, but work with citizens, because people do want to take responsibility. People do want to pay their fines and fees. I don't believe for a minute that the majority of these cases where people are trying to skirt the system, people want to pay. We have research to show that, but we have to find ways to make it more efficient and make it and work with our citizens so that we can pay. And when people pay them, it puts money into our economy. It puts money back into these systems. And so I agree with you all. And I want to say thank you. I want to open it up for questions from our audiences. We have about 30 minutes left, and I will give each of you panelists an opportunity for closing statements also. But Wesley, if we have questions, you want to go ahead with those? Wesley.
Okay, I'm here. Sorry about that. We do have a number of questions in the Q&A. So our first question is from Tina. She says, please help me to understand why I was in court yesterday and witnessed people that couldn't afford to pay their fines were assessed an additional $40 to get on a payment plan. Make that make sense, please.
If I can, it doesn't. And I don't think there's any way any of us can sit here and say that makes sense. The whole purpose of the payment plan is you're saying, I can't pay that entire fee at once. You shouldn't be penalized for then trying to, to still figure out how to be able to put food in your family's mouths and a roof over your head. The same thing for like, if someone, if they say they can't pay the fine, they might have the option of doing community service. Well, that costs money too. And that I don't understand it.
Yeah, I was going to basically say the same thing, that it actually doesn't make sense. And I think that it's important for us to start calling out and questioning these things that just don't make sense perpetually throughout our lifetime. We've been seeing things in our community that don't make sense. And I think it's just, and it's kind of like what was mentioned earlier by Assemblywoman Nguyen, this summer of unrest, what happened to George Floyd, what's happened here in Las Vegas to multiple people, it doesn't make sense. So yes, I think it's really important that we start questioning the things that we've been kind of just conditioned to believe are the way things should go, and start really pushing back against the status quo.
I'd like to mention for a moment, this young lady talked about, I think, or Kendra, you mentioned community service. We at the Fines and Fees Justice Center are looking at this not only here in Nevada, but in other states that we're in and across the country. And so we're working with legislators, and Assemblywoman Nguyen, I believe we submitted some language to you. We want to make payment plans uniform. I don't think it's efficient at all to have people have to pay to get on a payment plan or to do community service. I mean, the whole point of doing community service, as Kendra, you mentioned, is because I don't have the money to pay this fine or this fee or this ticket. And so why should I have to pay to do community service? And another one of the things that we're asking for is that the definition of what qualifies as community service be expanded. Earlier, I mentioned the example of Texas. Texas has a system of community service where if someone is doing something that's already benefiting their community. For example, they may be volunteering at their kids' school, or they may be participating in furthering their own education. Texas, in some cases, will allow that to count as community service because people are doing it anyway. And so I think it's a great model, and I think it's definitely something that we need to look at and find a way to implement here in Nevada so that we can work with our citizens and make it easier for people to satisfy these requirements. And so I wanted to mention that. Wesley, I'll let you give us our next question.
Sure, I'm going to go a little bit out of order because this one matches a question we got over Facebook too, but this one's from Barb. She says, thanks so much for this panel. I read the text of the bill and it looks like it's eliminating warrants for traffic tickets. That's great. Is it reducing the cost of these tickets? Can you explain exactly what this bill will do?
Well, I can tell you it's currently 73 pages. So I'm going to just kind of hit some of the highlights. It is a bill that was introduced in 2019, but I do intend on making it better as far as I'm concerned. I think there's always room for improvement. I think there's room to improve how we are doing community service. I know we made some steps during the 2019 session that actually went through that was hopeful to curb some of these fines, allow some more warning. I think there was a 30-day like grace-ish kind of period that we instituted. So I think that was very good first steps in trying to limit the amount of fines. It's definitely something that if we're not able to get it into Assembly Bill 116, I think that we have some work in the future to see how these cities, how these counties, how they start enacting the civil infractions. Because I think that's something that we need to look at. I've learned a lot about this, a lot from Leisa herself and some of the research that I've been able to get through NCSL and other states and what they're doing. Some places have like income-based fines. Because let's face it, you could have someone who is incredibly wealthy and will just just disobey the laws of our traffic safety laws because they can pay whatever the fine is. They can pay it right there probably when they were pulled over. But I don't think that's the intent. I think the intent is to like protect our public from habitual speeders. So I think incorporating more of an education piece might be something that we also consider as well. But as far as the bill, I encourage you to follow the bill at Nellis, which is the legislative website. I do anticipate that there will be a lot of amendments that are clarifying and incorporate some of these other ideas that weren't incorporated into this bill introduced last session. And hopefully we'll have a hearing. I'm trying to get some of those amendments more solidified before I ask for a hearing in front of the Assembly Judiciary, just so we have a better starting place to have a full discussion about what's included, how it's going to look, how it's going to affect our community. So I would encourage you to follow Assembly Bill 116.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Wesley, I will take the next question.
All right, this one is from Scott on Facebook, and I feel like it's been talked about a little, but it might bear repeating. He says, the question is, how do you get people to follow the law without the threat of consequences?
Who wants to take that one?
I'll go, Kendra. So there are still consequences if it's an infraction. You still have to pay the fine. And if you don't pay the fine, you go to collections. And I think a lot of us know that that's not a nice place to be, to have collectors coming after you. So there still are consequences. But more importantly, what we've seen, and even during COVID, when everyone is having, a really tough time and people are really strapped for cash, as we heard in Carson, their revenue actually increased when they got rid of this fear of going into custody. And since these are misdemeanor cases, it's a possible punishment of up to 6 months in jail. That punishment, again, doesn't do anything in terms of curbing that conduct. And it's more likely for individuals who are faced with that fear of they could go to jail if they go to the hearing, and if they don't have that amount to pay, they don't show up. And it's not because they don't want to, it's because they're so afraid of those horrible consequences that we talked about: losing their job, losing their housing, losing their kids. And it's that crippling fear that keeps them from doing what they want to do, and just because they can't. And so there are other ways in order to ensure that they pay that isn't the threat of being hauled back into the jail.
We'll Wiz with AFP here, Kendra, to piggyback on that. We here believe also the most 6 dangerous words are, there ought to be a law. And since Scott question mentioned the word law, we as a society have to revisit a lot of these laws are in the books to begin with. Charles Koch said that government's the only entity that has a monopoly on lethal force. And I think each and every one of us on this Zoom calls recognize what lethal force has done to a lot of innocent lives across the country whose lives were deprived. And the Constitution protects those lives through due process. And we have to recognize that there's a lot of laws on the books that should be repealed that can prevent these type of interactions, yet alone people being in these type of circumstances, to where it becomes more of what is your economic means to freedom rather than did you truly commit a crime. And when we mean crime, we're talking about something that poses a threat to the safety and health of our communities.
And I want to make one last point on this. That these are all amazing points. We also have to understand that, like, we need to be honest with ourselves. Most people don't know what the actual punishments are for almost any crimes, right? We hear this in the legislature all the time. Oh, we're going to take this from a category C felony, we're going to make it a category B felony, and that's going to stop people from doing it. Nobody committing these crimes understands these punishments until after. Some people might know that you don't pay a traffic ticket, a minor traffic ticket, and there's a warrant for your arrest, but most people don't. If you go around and ask your family, ask your friends, see who actually knows this. So if we're talking about this like as a deterrent or as like a carrot and a stick, like the education's not there and people just don't know. They don't know until they get arrested. So it doesn't actually work like that.
And I would just add, and I agree with everything else that was already said, but I think that one thing is like, we've never done it. Like we've never actually had a scenario where, you know, there was no consequences for not paying your traffic tickets. And then all of a sudden, you know, everybody started speeding more and everybody started getting more tickets and it just like got escalated out of control. That's actually never happened. So my kind of response to that is like, where is the data to show that that actually is a possibility? You know, so I think we're just conditioned to believe that, you know, we need these, you know, someone referred to it on an earlier call this morning, and we need, you know, something to dangle in front of people. And we actually don't. And I think that also coupled with that is we have to look at the people who are actually impacted by this. Look at the zip codes that they come from. Look at the income brackets that they come from. That alone is evident of the fact that like they don't have an extra $1,200 to pay tickets. So it is a lack of resources. And so I think there's some common sense and some you know, common reasoning that has to take place here. But really, I just challenge folks to who asked that question about, you know, how are we going to deter people from, you know, speeding or getting traffic tickets if we don't have any way to punish them. I just challenge y'all to really think deeper about that, because we don't have to do things the way they've always been done. We're going into a new year. We're going into, you know, post-pandemic. I think we need to start thinking about our society as a whole differently and how we solve these societal problems outside of the criminal justice system, and how we really look at and categorize safety in our community.
Thank you, Leslie. You know, I wouldn't just mention that. I think it's interesting in discussions about traffic warrants and driver license suspension, that's a comment that always comes up. We believe, as you said, Leslie, that there has to be some really harsh punishment to get people to comply. Well, you know, again, looking at some of the data from around the country for people who have for states who have already decriminalized traffic warrants, that simply does not support that. What the data does support, that is when you remove these barriers, the additional fines, the being able to get to court, the not being able to get on a payment plan, the fees, when you eliminate those barriers, people actually do pay. And so I agree with you that we have to rethink why we use the system that we currently use. How did we get here? I'm sorry, I think it was Nick who asked that question earlier. How did we get here? That's a question that I think all of us should be thinking about and answering that question. Where did this system come from? Why do we use this system? And is it actually helping us? Is it creating a way for people to pay? Is it making us more safe? And the answer to that, you know, I'm going to say is in many cases, no, but I think it's something that we all definitely have to start thinking about. So Wesley, if there are any other questions, go ahead. I'll get off my soapbox for now.
You're fine. We do have a couple more questions, and I will say for everyone watching, we are going to have a hard stop at 7:30, but I think we have time to get to these. Now, this next one's a little bit long and intimidating to me, but I think this brain trust is adequate in taking it on. So it says from Radia, the goal absolutely is to eliminate fees and hopefully fines. And a million thank yous to all of you who are working on this important and pressing objective. In the meantime, however, A strategy to waiving these fees and fines is to show an individual's lack of financial resources, but some city attorneys and courts are resistant to this approach, noting that it purportedly creates a, quote, slippery slope, end quote, of eliminating these onerous penalties for all individuals. For example, some courts, specifically municipal courts like North Las Vegas and Henderson, do not appear to conduct Gilbert hearings. Some prosecutors appear to know about NRS 176.085, which gives the court discretion to waive or reduce fines and administrative assessments if the fine or assessment is, quote, excessive in relation to the individual's financial position. What is the strategy for addressing this reality while we wait for the hopeful elimination of these penalties?
Do any one of you panelists want to take that? If not, I will.
I can. I think
Okay.
Definitely I can say, in working Assembly Bill 116 currently, the hesitation is directly from those municipal like courts and probably the ones that you specifically addressed in your question. But I think there's always hesitancy for change. I think people are very uncomfortable. They like the status quo. They know how that exists. They know how that works. And so people are always like, the sky's falling when it's not in fact falling. And in fact, it could probably be better if they, enacted some of these like changes. So I think that is always something that, we are up against in trying to convince people to make these kind of changes. I think like the Fines and Fees Center, I think the ACLU, I think the Mass Liberation, all these organizations, Americans for Prosperity, have really taken a concerted effort to, educate people on what this change means for them, how it is going to change things, and that sometimes that slippery slope is not a bad thing. We shouldn't penalize a speeding ticket with 6 months in jail. And that's the same penalty for someone who batters their like spouse. Like those are the same penalties. There should be some like fairness and justice with how we are penalizing those type of penalties. As we've turned things that were felonies into simple misdemeanors, I always remind them, you still have business. You still have things to prosecute. Things that were felonies are now appropriately misdemeanors. And so if we're giving you these other misdemeanors, we can take away these other misdemeanors that shouldn't be the same crime. So that's kind of what the conversations that I have with them. And I also have that same conversation when they are scared about the lack of revenue or the lack of like income. I agree with Wiz, we shouldn't be funding our government on the backs of traffic tickets. But, even with that say, I was like, well, you need to tell me what your numbers are for the people that you are no longer incarcerating because they are serving time on traffic tickets. Tell me what those numbers are. Tell me the time that we are saving not having a clerk in a court office that is inputting traffic warrants into the system. Tell me where we're saving money, where a police officer doesn't have to drive someone from where were you at? Flamingo and Maryland, take you down there, impound your car, like bring you down there, book you in on a $50 like cell phone ticket. Give me those costs. I want to know how many of those you're going to save if you're not incarcerating and you're not arresting on those warrants. So I'm constantly reminding some of the jurisdictions that are hesitant that they're still going to have plenty to do, unfortunately, and hopefully they'll be using their time wisely, like, protecting victims in battery domestic violence situations instead of, arresting Wiz on a, $50 like cell phone ticket.
Well, what I'd like to add to that is in 2019, legislation was passed that implemented a mandatory ability to pay assessments. Courts are supposed to be asking people who come in with traffic violations, are you able to pay this? And though there's no standard form or anything, which is something else that we're asking for at the Fines and Fee Justice Center, that there be a standard way of implementing that law. Courts are supposed to ask the people that come in for fines and fees or traffic violations, are you able to pay this? And if they say, no, I'm not able to, they're supposed to then ask them, would you like to do community service? One of the things that we've learned is maybe that's not being applied. And so I would say to anybody that's going to court for a ticket that's appearing, if you're not asked that question, are you able to pay? Then you remind them that, aren't you supposed to ask me, am I able to pay this ticket? Or you make sure that you let them know that you're not able to pay this and you would like to do community service. You should do that, and the courts are by law supposed to abide by that. I think we have time for about one more question, Wesley, and then I want to give each of the panelists a couple of minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, to offer any closing remarks.
Excellent. Okay, well, I guess our last question of the night then comes from Facebook, from Lance. He says, are there any websites that provide transparency regarding what traffic fines fund? Suggestions for traffic fines could be assisting mental health and substance abuse programs, providing funding for shelters that provide housing assistance.
Who wants to take that one? Assemblywoman, are you able to address that question?
I'm cutting in and out of sound. Hold on one second.
Okay.
What I will say to that, Lisa, there's numerous organizations, although there's not a specific website, there's numerous organizations out there that are taking on more of the data analytics behind our criminal justice system. And again, because we've done a great job across the country and uniting to address this huge issue, a lot of organizations are starting to kind of foster some of those. But what I will say also, there's a lot of hearings happening in your community, especially I think about 2 years ago, I attended one where the municipal court administrator was asked a direct question in regards to, like, where does the money go that people pay to be on this payment program? And how long, how much debt was acquired to institute this program? And then what year will, we basically pay off this debt? And it was sad to say, but that government official didn't even have those numbers. So that's a very valid question. And I look forward to finding multiple organizations out there that are actually aggregating this data so that we can create more transparency for the public to see what's happening with their dollars. And yes, when people are paying these type of fees, we consider them to be similar to taxes. And these should be public information that every single person is privy to.
And I'll just add, I think Wiz handled that really well, that it is difficult to find. There's some information on some courts' websites where they put specifically what fees and assessments are made for. Assessments are located in our statutes or in the NRS. But luckily, we actually did an interim study for I think it was the 2017-2018 interim session on fines and fees and decriminalizing traffic tickets, where a lot of jurisdictions put that information up. And so if you look on the Nellis website and go to that interim committee, you can find information from the majority of the courts where they do outline what things go to and why, and actually why the assessments and their reasoning for all their fines and fees.
That's a good point, Kendra. I'll also add that in some cases, in my efforts with the Fines and Fees Justice Center to obtain some of this information and submitting public records requests, some of the jurisdictions simply said, we're not by law required to collect this data, and so we don't. And so we had a difficult time getting some of this data from many of the jurisdictions. And so we're hoping that with AB 116 and the data reporting requirement that we hope to get in there, that it will eliminate some of that. We'll actually have more of this data that publicly available where people can know exactly where this money is going. All right, with that, we've got about 6 minutes. I want to take a moment to thank everyone that is watching and thank you for your questions. Thank you for your interest in this topic. This is not the last town hall that we plan to do. I encourage you to follow the Fines and Fees Justice Center at finesandfeesjusticecenter.com. I encourage you to follow the ACLU, follow PLAN, and stay abreast of this issue. And certainly, get onto the Nevada Legislative website and create an account. It's a free account with Nellis. You can follow AB 116. You can keep up with other bills that are coming before the legislature. And we encourage your participation in this process. And so with that, I want to give each of you a couple of minutes to close. And I'll start with you, Wiz. Any closing remarks?
Well, first and foremost, thank you, Leisa, for doing a tremendous job in putting this event on. This is what it's all about. It's about educating our constituents about the issues that matter and affect the community. Hats off and huge shout out to Assemblywoman Rochelle Nguyen. She has been a fierce voice up in Carson City on these type of issues, especially with criminal justice reform. And we stand very proud to support AB 116. And we are working diligently to bring more educational perspectives to a diverse group of communities, especially up in the legislative body. But again, I think the most important thing here is to make sure that we recognize we need to rethink the way law enforcement interacts with local communities and ensure that we are doing like every single thing we can, especially with bills like this, to rebuild that trust. And forcing police officers to act as tax collectors, that's not in the Constitution, and it doesn't help to rebuild that trust. So we're excited to be a part of this, and just know that March 18th, 6 p.m., we do have a town hall, and we want to make sure everybody joins us on that, where we'll be talking about criminal justice reform efforts that we're taking on. And if you don't have our information, visit us at Americans for Prosperity Nevada on Facebook. And again, Leisa, thank you, and you're doing a tremendous job.
Thank you, Wiz. I really appreciate that. Kendra, do you have any closing remarks? And panelists, feel free, as Wiz did, if you have any upcoming events that you'd like to share with the folks that are watching and invite them to, feel free to do that. Kendra?
Thank you. I just want to end with really decriminalizing traffic tickets is something that impacts every citizen in our state. And I want to thank Leisa as well as Assemblywoman Nguyen for all of the hard work that you both are doing and everybody else on this panel to really work towards stopping to decriminalize poverty. We've heard stories tonight from people who didn't commit violent offenses or really things that anyone would think of as being a reason to strip someone of their dignity, to take them into custody, to strip them into clothing, put them in a cell. And it really, I want to harp on just how traumatic this is and why. Why are we doing it? It's unnecessary, unwanted, and unjustified. And so we need to change that. We don't need to be traumatizing our citizens, their family, their communities, or having people be afraid that they're going to lose their lives because they're pulled over by the police because they have a warrant and know that could have a bad interaction. Unfortunately, all of us know too well the names of the individuals who've lost their lives for silly infractions or things that should be infractions. So our citizens shouldn't be facing incarceration solely for being indigent. And my office, as well as myself, really support your efforts. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kendra. Assemblywoman Nguyen, I'm going to take a minute to offer your closing remarks.
Thank you, and I apologize about my
It's
sound
okay.
error. It was really user error, as my son would say. He's like, "Okay, boomer." You think I'd get better at it, but I'm not. I just want to thank you guys for having me on here. I think anytime we can have these conversations with people in the community to educate them, I love it when people are getting involved in things that impact all of us. This highlights in your personal stories and you sharing them with and Leslie and Leisa. I think, this also points out the racial injustice. I will point out that of the 6 of us on this panel, the 3 people of color are the ones that, are not only that statistic, but are, the ones with personal stories in this area. And that's something that we shouldn't look away from and we need to address, and hopefully AB 116 will be a start in the right direction.
Thank you so much. Leslie, you can just take 1 minute.
Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited that the Fines and Fees Justice Center is here in Nevada. And I also want to just thank you, Assemblywoman Nguyen, for saying that. It's like, yes, the 3 Black people on this panel are the ones with personal stories of having been arrested for traffic tickets. And that is, in alignment with the data that was presented. So I think that that's also really important for us to, like you said, not look away from and confront it. So thank you. And if you want to know more about the Mass Liberation Project, you can go on our website, massliberationnv.org. We also have a Facebook page, Mass Liberation Project NV. And again, just my, closing call out is to the community. we really need to be engaged in this process. We really need to be engaged in what's happening up at the legislature. We say, you know, don't make laws for us without us. And in order for that to happen, we have to engage in the process. And I think we are seeing things done a little bit differently. We're seeing impacted people being brought into the fold more so than years before that I've experienced the legislature. And that's really important. And hopefully we continue to see that collaboration. So thank you for having me on. And I'm looking forward to making sure this bill gets passed.
Thank you, Leslie. And on that note, regarding the community, I want to take a minute to highlight one more organization, a community organization, the Clark County Black Caucus, that has done tremendous work on this issue. And so making that call to action and asking people to get involved, find an organization, visit the Clark County Black Caucus website at ccblackcaucus.com and get involved. Find that organization and other organizations that are leading on this issue. Again, we thank you so much for watching. Everyone, please have a good night and stay safe.